A millionaire saw his ex-wife on the streets with a baby. What she told him about the child left him shaking. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. Enjoy the story. The city buzzed with life as rain poured down in steady sheets, bouncing off the crowded sidewalks and creating rivers along the streets. Cars honked in frustration, their headlights cutting through the gray gloom of the early evening. Daniel Grayson, a name synonymous with power and success, stepped out of his sleek black limousine. His sharp, tailored suit seemed impervious to the rain, as if even nature knew not to touch him. The familiar weight of his status settled on his shoulders as he adjusted his tie and started toward one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Inside, a table of influential investors awaited him, their money ready to fund his next venture. The restaurant glowed warmly in the distance, a beacon of comfort amid the chaos of the city. Daniel's stride was purposeful, his mind already rehearsing the persuasive words he would use over dinner. But just as he stepped off the curb, something caught his attention. A figure huddled beneath the torn awning of a closed shop. It wasn't unusual to see the homeless seeking shelter in such places, but something about this figure stopped him mid-step. He turned his head, squinting through the rain, and his breath caught in his chest. She sat hunched on a damp piece of cardboard, her knees drawn close to her chest as she shielded a tiny bundle from the rain. Her hair, dark and matted, fell limply around her face, and her clothes were worn and soaked through. For a moment, he thought he must be mistaken, but then she turned her head, just slightly, and his heart dropped into his stomach. It was her, Jessica, his ex-wife. Daniel froze, his mind racing. It had been 10 years since he'd seen her, 10 long years since their divorce had left them both shattered. In that time, he had buried himself in work, building an empire that stood as a monument to his determination. He had convinced himself that she was just a chapter of his life, one he had closed for good. But now, here she was, sitting on the cold, wet pavement with a baby in her arms. The sight of her was both haunting and surreal, a ghost from a past he thought he had buried. Jessica's head lifted slightly, as if sensing his gaze. Their eyes met, and for a split second, time seemed to stand still. Her expression shifted from surprise to something he couldn't quite name. Shame, perhaps, or defiance. She quickly looked away, pulling the bundle in her arms closer to her chest. Daniel's feet moved before his mind could catch up, closing the distance between them. Jessica. His voice was low, almost drowned out by the rain, but it carried enough weight to make her flinch. She didn't answer, keeping her head down as if hoping he would simply disappear. Jessica, it's me. Daniel, he said again, his tone firmer this time. He crouched down, ignoring the rain soaking through his expensive suit, and peered at her. Up close, the years had taken their toll. Her face, once radiant, was lined with exhaustion, her eyes dull and hollow. And yet, it was unmistakably her. She sighed, a sound heavy with defeat, and finally looked up. "Dania, you shouldn't be here," she murmured, her voice hoarse. He frowned, taken aback by her response. "I shouldn't be here. Jessica, you're sitting on the street, in the rain, with a child. What the hell is going on?" Jessica shook her head, her grip tightening on the baby. "It's none of your business," she said softly, though there was no bite in her words. She looked away again, her body curling protectively around the small bundle in her arms. "None of my business," Daniel repeated, incredulous. He ran a hand through his damp hair, trying to contain his frustration. "You don't just get to say that. 10 years, Jessica. 10 years, and now I find you like this. You owe me an explanation." She let out a bitter laugh, though it sounded more like a sob. "I don't owe you anything, Daniel. Just go. Pretend you didn't see me." But Daniel couldn't. Something inside him wouldn't let him walk away, not this time. His eyes dropped to the baby she was holding so tightly. "Who's the child?" he asked, his tone softening. "Is it yours?" Jessica stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions, confusion, anger, and something he couldn't quite name. He studied the baby, noting the tiny hand peeking out from the blanket, the soft rise and fall of its breathing. "Jessica," he said, his voice low but firm, "I'm not leaving until you tell me what's going on." Jessica sighed again, this time with a weariness that seemed to come from deep within her. "It's complicated," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel shook his head. "Complicated? You're sitting on the street with a baby. That's not complicated. That's desperate." Her eyes flashed with a hint of the fire he remembered. "You think I don't know that?" she snapped, her voice rising for the first time. "You think I don't know how far I've fallen? I didn't ask for this, Daniel. I didn't ask for you to show up here and judge me." "I'm not judging you," he said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. He paused, searching for the right words. "I want to help." Jessica laughed bitterly. "Help? And then what? You go back to your penthouse, your perfect life, and forget about us." "Us?" The word slipped out before he could stop it. His gaze darted to the baby again, his mind racing. "Is the baby, Jessica, is the baby mine?" Her face crumpled at his words, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might cry. But instead, she shook her head and pulled the baby closer. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice barely audible. "None of this matters." Daniel stared at her, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to say, what to feel. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her there. "Come with me," he said suddenly, the words surprising even himself. Jessica looked at him, startled. "What?" "Come with me," he repeated. "You can't stay here. Let me help you. Just let me do this." Jessica hesitated, her eyes searching his. For a moment, he thought she might refuse. But then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Just for tonight." Daniel helped her to her feet, careful not to disturb the baby. He led her to the limousine, shielding her from the rain as best he could. As the driver opened the door, Jessica climbed in, holding the baby tightly. Daniel followed, settling into the seat across from her. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. As the car pulled away from the curb, Daniel looked at Jessica and the baby, his mind swirling with questions. He didn't know where this night would lead, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same. The limousine glided through the rain-soaked streets, its tires cutting through puddles in near silence. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. Jessica sat with her back pressed against the leather seat, Max bundled protectively in her arms. Her gaze flitted between the child and the world passing by through the tinted windows. Daniel, seated across from her, leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his sharp eyes locked on to her. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, but he struggled to voice even one. "I still can't believe this," Daniel said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but tinged with frustration. "After all these years, you show up like this. And with a child." Jessica flinched at the bluntness of his words. "I didn't exactly plan for this reunion, Daniel," she replied, her tone defensive. She looked down at Max, her fingers brushing gently over his blanket. "I never wanted you to see me like this." Daniel straightened, exhaling sharply. "That's not the point, Jessica. You didn't want me to see you, or you didn't want me to know." His words lingered in the air, the accusation clear. Jessica shook her head, her grip on Max tightening. "It's not that simple." "Then make it simple," Daniel snapped, leaning closer. "You owe me that much." Jessica's head shot up, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and hurt. "Oh, You think I owe you something after all these years? After what happened between us? Daniel's jaw tightened. I didn't end things between us lightly, Jessica. We both made mistakes, but that doesn't mean you had a right to shut me out completely. Especially if this child, he hesitated, his voice softening. If he's mine. Jessica looked away, her eyes focusing on the rain streaking the windows. For a long moment, the only sound was Max's soft breathing and the rhythmic patter of the rain. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and heavy with emotion. I thought I was doing what was best. For who? Daniel shot back. Because it certainly wasn't for me. Or for Max. Jessica closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her choices had finally caught up with her. For everyone, she said quietly. You made it clear you didn't want children, Daniel. You told me yourself, remember? I have no time for a family. Those were your exact words. Daniel flinched as the memory resurfaced. He had said those words more than once during their arguments years ago. At the time, his career had been his singular focus, and the idea of slowing down for a family had seemed impossible. But hearing them repeated now, in this context, made him feel hollow. That doesn't mean I wouldn't have stepped up, he said softly, his voice laced with regret. You should have given me the chance. Jessica looked back at him, her expression unreadable. And what would you have done, Daniel? Would you have dropped everything? Changed your life for us? Or would you have written a check and called it a day? The words hit Daniel like a slap. He opened his mouth to respond but stopped, unsure of what to say. Would he have been able to prioritize them back then? He didn't know, and the uncertainty stung. The car slowed as they approached Daniel's building, its towering glass facade gleaming even in the rain. The driver opened the door, and Daniel stepped out first, holding an umbrella. He extended a hand to Jessica, who hesitated before taking it. Max stirred in her arms, letting out a soft whimper as the cold air hit him. Inside the lobby, the warmth and luxury of Daniel's world engulfed them. Jessica's eyes darted around, taking in the marble floors, high ceilings, and modern art adorning the walls. She had known Daniel lived well, but this was overwhelming. She tightened her grip on Max, feeling more out of place with each step. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent, save for the faint hum of the machinery. Daniel stole glances at Jessica, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes avoided his. He wanted to reach out, to say something that would ease the growing distance between them, but the words eluded him. When the elevator doors opened, Jessica stepped into the penthouse and stopped. The space was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. The sleek, modern furniture and immaculate decor spoke of wealth and meticulous attention to detail. It was a far cry from the cold, wet streets she had been calling home. This is different, Jessica murmured, her voice barely audible. Daniel set the umbrella aside, watching her closely. It's just a place. What matters right now is you and Max. Jessica glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. That's not how it feels. Daniel frowned, but decided not to push further. Instead, he gestured toward a living room. Sit down. I'll get something for Max. Jessica hesitated, then nodded. She settled onto the plush sofa, cradling Max in her arms. The baby stirred again, his tiny face scrunching up before he let out a soft cry. Jessica rocked him gently, whispering soothing words until he calmed. Daniel returned moments later with a warm bottle. He handed it to Jessica, who took it with a murmured, "Thank you." As she fed Max, Daniel sat across from her, his gaze unwavering. "Jessica," he began, his voice quieter now, "I need to know. Is Max my son?" Jessica paused, the bottle still in her hand. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, he thought she might deny it again. But then she sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth. "Yes," she said finally. "Max is yours." The words hit Daniel like a tidal wave. He leaned back, his mind racing as he tried to process the revelation. He studied the baby in Jessica's arms, seeing him in a new light. The small, delicate features, the dark hair. It was as if the pieces were finally falling into place. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice tinged with hurt. Jessica looked down at Max, her fingers brushing his tiny hand. "Because I was scared. I didn't know how you'd react. And by the time I thought about reaching out, it felt too late. You had moved on." Daniel ran a hand over his face, the weight of her words sinking in. "You should have given me the chance," he said, his voice softer now. "I deserve to know." Jessica nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Maybe. But I didn't think you'd want this life. And I couldn't handle the rejection." Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I can't change the past, Jessica. But now that I know, I'm not walking away. Max is my son, and I'll do whatever it takes to be there for him. For both of you." Jessica looked at him, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "I don't know if I can trust that, Daniel." "Not yet. You don't have to trust me now," he said firmly. "But let me earn it." Jessica hesitated, then nodded slowly. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of a different future, a future where she wasn't alone. The following morning arrived reluctantly, with pale sunlight filtering through the penthouse's expansive windows. Jessica sat at the edge of the guest room bed, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress as if grounding herself in the reality of her new surroundings. Max lay asleep in the crib Daniel had arranged to be brought in overnight, his small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. The sight of him calmed her, but it didn't erase the storm inside her. The door opened softly, and Daniel stepped in, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. He paused when he saw her, his usually composed expression tinged with uncertainty. "I thought you might need this," he said, holding out one of the mugs. Jessica looked up, surprised by the gesture, and took the cup with a small nod. "Thanks," she murmured, her fingers wrapping around the warmth. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, his gaze drifting to Max. "He's a good sleeper," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I guess he didn't get that from me." Jessica managed a faint smile, her eyes fixed on the coffee swirling in her cup. "No, he didn't get that from me either," she replied. The moment of shared levity faded quickly, replaced by the weight of everything left unsaid. Daniel cleared his throat. "I think we need to talk." Jessica sighed, setting the coffee down on the nightstand. "I figured you'd say that." He stepped closer, pulling a chair from the corner of the room and sitting across from her. "Jessica, I'm not trying to corner you, but there's so much I don't understand, and I can't help if I don't know the full story." She looked at him, her expression guarded. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," he said simply. "Why you left without telling me. Why you didn't reach out when you found out about Max. What happened to you over these years. I need to know." Jessica stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether she could trust him with the truth. Finally, she exhaled, her shoulders slumping slightly. "You want the truth, Daniel? Fine. But it's not pretty." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "I can handle it." Jessica began slowly, her voice low and steady, though it trembled at the edges. "After the divorce, I had nothing. I walked away from our life because I thought I could start over. But it wasn't that simple. The job I thought I had lined up fell through, and I couldn't afford the rent on my own. I ended up couch surfing for a while, staying with friends who could barely afford to help themselves, let alone me." Daniel's hands clenched into fists on his lap, but he didn't interrupt. "Then I found out I was pregnant," Jessica continued, her voice cracking slightly. "And suddenly, everything became so much harder. No one wanted to hire a pregnant woman with no stable address. I tried to keep going, tried to make it work, but one thing after another kept knocking me down." Daniel's chest tightened as he listened. He had always known Jessica to be strong, resilient, but the weight of her words revealed a struggle he hadn't imagined. "Why didn't you come to me?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "I could have helped." Jessica let out a bitter laugh. "Help? Like you helped when we were married. Daniel, you made it clear that your career came first. I wasn't going to beg for scraps of your attention just so you could feel like a hero." Her words stung, but Daniel couldn't deny the truth in them. He had been consumed by ambition during their marriage, blind to the needs of the person who had stood by his side. Jessica continued, her voice growing quieter. "By the time Max was born, I was living in a shelter. It wasn't safe, but it was all I had. I thought about calling you so many times, but every time, I stopped myself. I didn't want Max to feel like an afterthought, like he was just another obligation in your busy life." Daniel's jaw tightened as he processed her words. "He wouldn't have been. You both would have had everything you needed. And what about what we needed emotionally, Daniels?" Jessica shot back, her eyes flashing. "It wasn't just about money. It was about feeling like we mattered to you." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. She was right. There was no denying it. "You're right," he admitted after a moment. "I failed you, and I can't change that. But now that I know about Max, I want to be better. I want to do this right." Jessica studied him, her expression softening slightly. "And what does doing it right look like to you?" "It means being there for Max," Daniel said firmly. "It means giving him a home, a future. And it means making sure you don't have to go through this alone anymore." Jessica looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "It's not that simple, Daniel. We can't just pretend the past didn't happen." "I'm not asking you to," Daniel said quietly. "But I'm asking for a chance to build something better." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Jessica glanced at Max, who stirred slightly in his crib, and then back at Daniel. "You say you want to be there for him," she said finally. "But what happens when the novelty wears off? When things get hard?" "They won't," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "Because this isn't about me. It's about him. And I'm not walking away from him, no matter what." Jessica searched his face, looking for any sign of insincerity. She found none. "You really mean that, don't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do," Daniel said. "For once in my life, I know exactly what matters." Jessica nodded slowly, her resolve softening. "Okay," she said quietly. "We'll try. But I'm warning you, Daniel. If you hurt him, if you let him down, I won't forgive you." "You won't have to," Daniel said firmly. "I promise." Jessica looked at him, a glimmer of hope breaking through the walls she had built around herself. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. As Max stirred again, letting out a soft cry, Daniel stood. "I'll get him," he said, moving toward the crib. He picked up the baby with surprising ease, cradling him in his arms. Max quieted almost immediately, his tiny hand clutching at Daniel's shirt. Jessica watched the scene, her heart conflicted. She wanted to believe in this version of Daniel, the one who seemed willing to fight for them. But the shadows of their past loomed large, and trust wouldn't come easily. Still, as she watched Daniel with Max, a small part of her began to hope. The rain had finally stopped by the time the city began to wake. Golden sunlight streamed through the penthouse's massive windows, illuminating the sleek surfaces and casting long shadows across the room. Jessica stood in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of tea. The silence felt strange after the chaos of the last few days, but it was a welcome reprieve. She glanced at Max, who sat in a high chair Daniel had brought in that morning. He gurgled happily, banging a toy against the tray. It was a simple moment of calm, but Jessica couldn't relax. Her mind churned with uncertainty, replaying the words Daniel had said the night before. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Daniel walking in, his phone in hand. He placed it on the counter and poured himself a cup of coffee. "Morning," he said, his voice casual but careful, as though he were testing the waters. Jessica nodded. Morning. She watched him as he sipped his coffee, his gaze drifting to Max. There was something different about him, an unfamiliar softness that hadn't been there years ago. Daniel set his cup down and leaned against the counter. How'd you sleep? Jessica hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. It was fine, she said finally. Better than I've slept in a while. Good, Daniel said, his tone sincere. You need rest. Max needs you to be okay. Jessica raised an eyebrow. And you suddenly know what Max needs. Daniel didn't flinch. I'm learning, he said simply. I know I have a lot to figure out, but I'm not going anywhere. Jessica sighed, her shoulders sagging. That's what I'm afraid of, Daniel. That this is just temporary. That once the reality sets in, you'll disappear. Daniel's expression darkened. I won't. I told you, Jessica, I'm here for the long haul. And what happens when your work calls? Jessica asked, her voice rising slightly. What happens when this isn't convenient anymore? Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. I've already spoken to my team. I'm stepping back from a few projects. Jessica blinked, caught off guard. You, stepping back? That doesn't sound like the Daniel Grayson I remember. Maybe I'm not the Daniel Grayson you remember, he said quietly. Maybe I'm trying to be better. Jessica studied him, searching for any sign of pretense. She saw none. Why, Daniel? Why now? He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Because I can't ignore this anymore. For years, I convinced myself that my career was all that mattered. But then you showed up, with Max, and everything shifted. He's my son, Jessica. I can't turn my back on that. Jessica shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. It's not that simple. You can't just decide to change overnight. I know, Daniel admitted. But I can start somewhere. The conversation hung in the air, heavy with unspoken doubts and fragile hope. Max banged his toy against the high chair again, breaking the tension. Daniel chuckled softly and walked over, kneeling beside the chair. You've got some strength, buddy, he said, his voice light but filled with affection. Max looked at him with wide eyes before letting out a squeal of delight. Daniel reached out, letting Max grab his finger, and smiled. Jessica watched the interaction, her chest tightening. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. For so long, she had done everything alone, carrying the weight of motherhood without anyone to share it with. Seeing Daniel step into that role, even in the smallest way, was both comforting and terrifying. He likes you, Jessica said quietly, almost to herself. Daniel looked up, his smile softening. I hope so. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure he always does. Jessica turned back to her tea, trying to hide the emotions swirling inside her. Words are easy, Daniel. Actions are harder. I know, he said, standing. And I'm ready to prove myself. Whatever it takes. Jessica didn't respond, but a part of her wanted to believe him. Later that day, Daniel suggested they take Max for a walk. Jessica hesitated at first, the idea of stepping back into the world overwhelming. But Daniel was insistent, and eventually, she agreed. They bundled Max into a stroller Daniel had arranged to be delivered, and the three of them stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The streets were bustling with activity, the city alive with its usual energy. Jessica kept her head down, uncomfortable with the curious glances they received. She wasn't used to being in places like this anymore, clean, affluent, safe. Daniel noticed her discomfort and slowed his pace, walking closer to her. You okay? He asked softly. Jessica nodded, though her grip on the stroller handle tightened. It's just been a long time since I've done this. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her arm. You're not alone, Jessica. We're in this together. His words, simple as they were, sent a wave of warmth through her. She looked at him, seeing a sincerity in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Thank you, she said quietly. They walked in silence for a while, the city's noise fading into the background. Max cooed happily in the stroller, oblivious to the complexities of the world around him. Jessica found herself relaxing, if only slightly. As they passed a park, Daniel stopped. "Let's sit for a bit," he suggested. Jessica hesitated, but followed his lead. They found a bench under a tree, the golden leaves rustling gently in the breeze. Max giggled as Daniel leaned down to make silly faces at him, the sound filling the air like music. Jessica watched them, her heart aching with a mix of emotions. She wanted to trust Daniel, to believe that he had truly changed. But the scars of their past were deep, and the fear of being hurt again lingered. Daniel straightened and looked at her. "Jessica," he began, his tone serious, "I know this won't be easy. I know I have a lot to make up for, but I need you to know that I'm all in. For you and for Max." Jessica held his gaze, her own eyes filling with tears. "I want to believe you, Daniel. I really do, but I don't know if I can." Daniel reached out, his hand covering hers. "Then let me show you. One day at a time." Jessica nodded, the smallest flicker of hope igniting in her heart. "Okay," she said softly. One day at a time. The air in the penthouse felt warmer as the days passed, though the tension between Daniel and Jessica lingered like a shadow in the corners. Daniel had thrown himself into the role of a father with surprising enthusiasm, learning to change diapers, warm bottles, and even soothe Max's cries with a patience that shocked Jessica. But despite his efforts, she couldn't shake the doubt that gnawed at her. Was this genuine, or was it just another project for Daniel to conquer before moving on? That morning, Jessica stood in the kitchen, feeding Max while Daniel flipped through papers at the dining table. His phone buzzed incessantly, and though he ignored it at first, the persistent vibrations eventually drew his attention. "Excuse me," he said, standing and moving toward the living room to take the call. Jessica listened quietly as his voice shifted into the sharp, confident tone he reserved for business. She couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was familiar, decisive, commanding, in control. When he returned a few minutes later, his expression was unreadable. He sat down, tapping his fingers against the table, as if weighing his next words. "What is it?" Jessica asked, sensing the shift in his mood. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's a client. There's an issue with one of our contracts, and they're demanding a face-to-face meeting. They want me to fly out tomorrow." Jessica stiffened, her hand pausing midair as she fed Max another spoonful of mashed bananas. "Tomorrow," she repeated, her voice tight. "I know it's not ideal," Daniel said quickly, holding up a hand as if to ward off her rising concerns. "But it's just for a couple of days. I'll be back before you know it." Jessica set the spoon down, her movements sharp. "This is exactly what I was afraid of, Daniel. The moment things get complicated, your work takes priority." "That's not fair," Daniel said, his tone defensive. "This isn't me choosing work over you or Max. This is me protecting everything I've built, so I can provide for both of you." "Provide?" Jessica's voice rose, the bitterness in her tone cutting through the air. "We don't need your money, Daniel. We need you. Max needs you." Daniel stood, frustration flashing across his face. "And I'm trying to be here, but I can't just walk away from everything. If I don't handle this, it could all fall apart." "Maybe it should," Jessica shot back. "Maybe you should let it fall apart and see what really matters." The words hung between them, sharp and unyielding. Max, sensing the tension, let out a soft whimper, breaking the silence. Jessica immediately turned her attention to him, her fingers brushing his cheek as she murmured soothing words. Daniel sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping. He walked over to the window, staring out at the city skyline. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet was heavy, filled with the weight of unsaid things. Finally, Daniel turned back to face her. "I know you don't believe me, "Jessica," he said quietly, "and I can't blame you, but I need you to trust that I'm doing this for the right reasons." Jessica looked up, her eyes filled with both frustration and exhaustion. "Trust isn't something you just ask for, Daniel. It's something you earn." "I know," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm willing to earn it, but I need you to meet me halfway." Jessica hesitated, her gaze shifting to Max, who had calmed and was now playing with his toy. "You want me to meet you halfway?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Then don't go." Daniel's jaw tightened, the internal conflict clear on his face. "Jessica, don't go," she repeated, her eyes locking onto his. "Prove to me that we're not just another obligation to you. Prove to me that this isn't just temporary." Daniel stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He thought of the meeting, the clients, the reputation he had worked so hard to build. But then he looked at Max, at the tiny hand clutching the edge of his high chair, and something inside him shifted. "All right," he said finally, his voice resolute. "I won't go." Jessica blinked, surprised by his response. "You mean it?" "I mean it," Daniel said, walking over to her. "Nothing is more important than being here with you and Max. Not now, not ever." Jessica searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation or insincerity. She found none. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Daniel was serious about this. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "But don't make me regret this, Daniel. Don't make Max regret it." "You won't," he promised, his voice steady. "I'll prove it to both of you." That evening, as the city lights twinkled outside the penthouse, Daniel sat on the floor with Max, stacking blocks and laughing as the baby knocked them over. Jessica watched from the sofa, her heart conflicted. She wanted to trust him, to believe that he could change, but the fear of being let down again lingered like a shadow, refusing to fade. Daniel looked up, catching her gaze. "You okay?" he asked, his tone gentle. Jessica nodded slowly. "I'm trying." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's all I can ask for." As Max let out a squeal of delight, Daniel turned his attention back to the baby, his laughter filling the room. For the first time in a long time, the penthouse felt less like a cold, sterile space and more like a home. Jessica leaned back, her eyes drifting closed as she allowed herself a moment of peace. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was a start. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting warm golden light across the penthouse. Jessica sat at the dining table, sipping her tea, while Max babbled happily in his high chair, smearing mashed fruit across his tray. Across from her, Daniel was unusually quiet, his eyes distant as he scrolled through emails on his tablet. It had been a few days since their tense argument, and though the air between them had softened, the tension lingered beneath the surface. Jessica stole a glance at him. She wanted to believe in the man he was trying to become, but doubts still clung to her like shadows. Trust wasn't something she could give easily anymore, not after everything they had been through. Max's delighted squeal broke the silence, drawing both their attention. Daniel smiled and reached over, wiping the baby's sticky face with a damp cloth. "You're a mess," he said playfully, earning another giggle from Max. Jessica couldn't help but smile at the interaction. "He seems to like having you around," she said softly. Daniel looked up, his expression a mixture of pride and something deeper, gratitude. "I like being around him," he admitted. "I didn't think I'd ever say that, but it's true." Jessica nodded, her gaze falling to the tea in her hands. "It's nice," she murmured, the words barely audible. The moment of quiet understanding was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Daniel stood, setting his tablet aside, and walked to answer it. A uniformed courier handed him a small package, which he signed for before returning to the table. "What's that?" Jessica asked, her curiosity piqued. Daniel opened the package, revealing a stack of documents and a small envelope. His expression darkened as he examined the envelope, his name written on the front in familiar handwriting. Jessica noticed the shift in his demeanor and frowned. "What is it?" Daniel hesitated, holding the envelope as though it carried a weight heavier than its size suggested. "It's from my father," he said finally. Jessica's breath hitched. She had met Daniel's father only a handful of times, but those encounters had left a lasting impression. The man had been cold, distant, and unyielding, a reflection of the pressure Daniel had always been under to succeed. "Are you going to open it?" she asked cautiously. Daniel sat back down, turning the envelope over in his hands. "I haven't spoken to him in years. Not since." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what this could be about." Jessica reached out, her hand brushing his. "Maybe it's important." Daniel met her gaze, the uncertainty in his eyes uncharacteristic for a man who always seemed in control. Finally, he nodded and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting immediately recognizable. As Daniel read, his expression shifted from confusion to shock and finally to something Jessica couldn't quite place. When he finished, he set the letter down, his hands trembling slightly. "Daniel." Jessica prompted, her voice gentle but insistent. "What does it say?" He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "It's an apology," he said, the disbelief clear in his tone. "My father. He's dying." Jessica's heart sank. Despite everything she knew about Daniel's strained relationship with his father, she could see the pain in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "He says he regrets the way he treated me," Daniel continued, his voice hollow. "That he pushed me too hard, expected too much. And now he's asking for a chance to make things right." Jessica leaned forward, her fingers brushing his arm. "What are you going to do?" Daniel shook his head, his gaze distant. "I don't know. Part of me wants to ignore it, to let him face the consequences of his choices. But another part," he paused, his voice faltering, "another part of me feels like I owe it to Max, to show him that family matters, even when it's complicated." Jessica nodded slowly. "Maybe this is your chance to heal, Daniel. For both of you." He looked at her, his expression softening. "And what about you? Do you think I can be the father Max needs?" The question caught Jessica off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "I think you're trying," she said finally. "And that means something." Later that evening, after Max had been put to bed, Daniel stood in the living room, staring out at the city lights. Jessica joined him, her arms crossed as she leaned against the doorframe. "You've been quiet," she observed. Daniel turned, his eyes heavy with thought. "There's a lot to process." Jessica walked over, standing beside him. "You don't have to do it alone." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's a new feeling." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the city stretching out before them like a sea of possibilities. Jessica finally spoke, her voice soft. "I know things have been hard between us, Daniel, but I see you trying, and that matters." Daniel looked at her, his expression filled with something unspoken. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." The next morning, Daniel made a decision. He called his father, the conversation brief but meaningful. As he hung up, he felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step forward. Jessica watched him from across the room, her heart softening as she saw the vulnerability in his eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward together. The air in the penthouse felt heavier as the days passed. Daniel had been quieter than usual, his thoughts consumed by the letter from his father. Jessica noticed the way his shoulders sagged slightly, the lines of tension etched on his face. She wanted to ask what he was feeling, but the delicate balance they had established felt too fragile to disturb. That morning, As the city buzzed with its usual energy, Jessica found herself alone with Max in the kitchen. She spoon-fed him mashed fruit while his tiny hands grabbed at the air, his cheerful babbles filling the space. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax, enjoying the simple pleasure of being present with her son. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Daniel's voice coming from the living room. He was on the phone, and though she couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. "Listen, I've already told you. This has to wait," Daniel said, his voice sharp. "I'm not leaving right now." "No, it's not negotiable." Jessica frowned, straining to hear more. The conversation continued, with Daniel's frustration growing with every word. Finally, there was a long pause, followed by a resigned sigh. "Fine, I'll call you back." Moments later, Daniel appeared in the kitchen, his expression stormy. Jessica looked up from feeding Max, her brow furrowing. "Everything okay?" "No," Daniel said, running a hand through his hair. "That was one of my clients. They're threatening to pull out of a deal if I don't meet with them in person." Jessica set the spoon down, her lips tightening. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them no," Daniel replied, his voice firm. "But they're not happy about it." Jessica leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "So you're staying?" "Of course I'm staying," Daniel said, his tone edging on defensive. "I told you. I'm not walking away from this." Jessica studied him, searching for any sign of doubt. "Good," she said finally, "because this isn't just about you, Daniel. It's about Max. He needs stability, and so do I." Daniel nodded, though her words seemed to hit a nerve. He walked to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I know that, Jessica. I'm trying." Jessica watched him silently, her thoughts swirling. She wanted to believe in his commitment, but the fear of being let down again refused to fade. "Trying isn't always enough," she said softly, almost to herself. Daniel froze, his back to her. He set the coffee cup down with a deliberate motion before turning to face her. "What does that mean?" Jessica hesitated, then sighed. "It means I've heard promises before, Daniel. You say you're staying, but how do I know you won't change your mind when things get hard?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm not that man anymore, Jessica." "Then prove it," she said, her voice steady. "Not with words, with actions." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Daniel stared at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "I will." Later that day, as Max napped in his crib, Jessica wandered through the penthouse, her thoughts restless. She found herself drawn to the office, the door slightly ajar. Inside, Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the letter from his father. His shoulders were slumped, and the weight of his emotions was evident in the way he held his head in his hands. Jessica knocked softly on the doorframe, and Daniel looked up, startled. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't hear you." Jessica stepped inside, her gaze falling to the letter. "Are you okay?" Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know. I keep reading this letter, trying to figure out what I'm supposed to feel. Anger, sadness, relief. I don't even know anymore." Jessica moved closer, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "It's okay not to know, Daniel. Feelings don't always come with instructions." He chuckled bitterly. "You sound like my therapist." Jessica smiled faintly. "Maybe I missed my calling." Daniel's expression softened, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. "I keep thinking about Max," he said quietly. "About the kind of father I want to be. And the kind of father I don't want to be." Jessica nodded. "You don't have to be perfect, Daniel. You just have to show up." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she rarely saw. "That's the thing, Jessica. I want to show up, for him, for you. But sometimes, it feels like I'm fighting against who I've always been." Jessica reached out, placing a hand over his. You're not that man anymore. You've already taken the first step by being here. The rest will come with time." Daniel looked down at their hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I fail?" Jessica squeezed his hand gently. "Then you get back up and try again. That's what being a parent is about." Daniel nodded, a flicker of determination returning to his eyes. "You're right. I can do this." That evening, as they sat together in the living room, Jessica watched as Daniel played with Max, his laughter filling the space. It was a side of him she hadn't seen in years, warm, unguarded, and completely present. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where this was their reality, a life where they weren't just surviving, but thriving together as a family. The thought scared her, but it also filled her with a quiet sense of hope. As Daniel looked up and caught her gaze, he smiled. "What?" Jessica shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Nothing. Just this. It's nice." Daniel's smile widened, and for a moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift. "Yeah," he said softly. "It is." The days that followed brought a cautious sense of peace to the penthouse. Daniel threw himself into fatherhood with an intensity that surprised even him. Every spare moment was spent with Max, feeding him, playing with him, and learning the subtleties of his son's needs. Jessica, though still guarded, began to soften, her walls slowly but surely lowering as she witnessed Daniel's determination. That morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, painting the living room in a warm glow. Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor with Max, who was giggling as he tried to stack colorful blocks into a wobbly tower. Jessica stood in the kitchen, sipping her tea and watching them with a mixture of amusement and quiet longing. It had been years since she had felt this sense of normalcy, and though it scared her to admit it, it felt good. "Careful, Max," Daniel said, his voice light and playful. "That tower's looking pretty unstable." Max babbled in response, his little hands smacking the blocks, sending them tumbling to the floor. Daniel let out an exaggerated gasp, which sent Max into a fit of laughter. Jessica smiled despite herself. "You're surprisingly good at this, you know," she said, walking over and leaning against the couch. Daniel glanced up at her, his expression playful. "What, you thought I'd be hopeless?" "I didn't say that," Jessica replied with a smirk. "But I didn't expect you to be so patient." "Guess I'm full of surprises," Daniel said, winking before turning back to Max. "Aren't I, buddy?" Max responded with a squeal, reaching out to grab Daniel's nose. Jessica laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar even to her. It felt strange but wonderful to let herself relax, to enjoy this moment without the weight of the past pressing down on her. Later that afternoon, as Max napped peacefully in his crib, Jessica and Daniel found themselves sitting in the living room. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that only came after days of shared experiences and unspoken understanding. Daniel broke the quiet first. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice careful, "about us, about the future." Jessica looked at him, her expression wary but curious. "What about it?" Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know I've said this before, but I want to make things right. Not just for Max, but for you too." Jessica's gaze softened, but her voice remained steady. "Daniel, you don't have to fix everything. I've learned how to take care of myself. Max and we were okay before you came back into our lives." "I know," Daniel said quickly, his tone earnest. "But I want to be part of your lives. I want us to be a family." Jessica exhaled, leaning back against the couch. "You say that now, but what happens when things get hard? When you have to choose between us and the life you've built for yourself?" "I've already made that choice," Daniel said firmly. "Jessica, I've let go of so many things I thought mattered, but none of them compare to you and Max. You're what matters now." Jessica searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation or doubt. She found none. "It's not that simple," Daniel, she said quietly, there's so much history between us. So much hurt. I know, Daniel said, his voice softening. But I also know that we've both changed. We're not the same people we were back then. And maybe that means we have a chance to start over. Jessica hesitated, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She wanted to believe him, to trust that this time would be different. But the fear of being hurt again loomed large. What if it doesn't work? She asked, her voice trembling. What if we just end up hurting each other again? Daniel reached out, his hand covering hers. Then we pick up the pieces and try again. Because that's what family does. Jessica looked down at their hands, her heart aching with both hope and fear. You're really serious about this, aren't you? I've never been more serious about anything in my life, Daniel said, his voice unwavering. I love Max and I. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. I still love you, Jessica. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. The words she had longed to hear and dreaded all at once hung in the air, waiting for her response. Finally, she whispered, Daniel, I don't know if I can say that back. Not yet. Daniel nodded, his expression understanding. That's okay. I'm not asking for everything all at once. I just want the chance to prove myself. To prove that this time, I'm all in. Jessica swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Okay, she said finally, but this isn't just about us. It's about Max. If this doesn't work, I won't let him get hurt. He won't, Daniel promised. Neither of you will. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the penthouse in a warm amber glow, Jessica found herself sitting on the balcony, the city stretching out before her like a sea of possibilities. Daniel joined her, carrying 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to her before sitting down in the chair beside her. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the day giving way to a tentative sense of peace. Jessica sipped her wine, her thoughts quieter than they had been in weeks. This feels nice, she admitted, breaking the silence. Daniel looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. It does. Jessica turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. Do you really think we can do this? Be a family? I do, Daniel said without hesitation. Because for the first time in my life, I know exactly what I want. And it's right here. Jessica nodded, her heart still cautious, but no longer closed off. One day at a time, she said softly. One day at a time, Daniel echoed, his voice filled with quiet determination. Inside, Max stirred in his crib, his tiny hand clutching the edge of his blanket. As the city lights twinkled outside, the 3 of them took their first steps toward a new beginning, together. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.